Good morning. Buenos dias. We'd like to get started. I am Rosina Bierbaum, and I serve as the chair of the Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel for the Global Environment Facility. And it's my pleasure to act as the moderator for today's conference. And it is a collaboration with a huge network: the Government of Colombia, the Convention on Biological Diversity, Conservation International, the Nature Conservancy, the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, the International Conservation Caucus Foundation, and of course, the Global Environment Facility. And we're so excited because we have assembled policymakers, the private sector, the public sector, civil society, and technical experts to provide insights from all our varied perspectives. But we have a common commitment to make progress on achieving Target 18 of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And so just as a reminder to what Target 18 is, here it's defined in both English and Spanish, and we highlighted some of the words. So by 2025, which is next year, eliminate, phase out, or reform incentives, including subsidies harmful for biodiversity, very importantly, in a proportionate, just, fair, and equitable way, reducing them by $500 billion a year by 2030, and scaling up positive incentives for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. No mean feat, but we have an amazingly distinguished group of speakers, and actually this participant list is quite star-studded as well. And I'm confident that with all this room's collective wit and wisdom, we will be able to deliver on our objectives. And here is what they are, threefold, really to recognize the crucial role of positive incentives and harmful subsidies, and align policy in nature and climate finance funding so that we can reduce harms to both nature and to climate. So we're climate and nature positive. The second goal is to identify the enabling conditions, the sources of transition finance, the challenges, and very importantly, lessons learned that can help to transform the incentive for nature. And then, based on what we've done in 1 and 2, how to scale up these activities to deliver Target 18 rapidly. And we hope that recommendations will be coming out of all the sections. You know, it's a terribly important but big task. And this group, we all know how crucial it is to really achieve transformational, nature positive, and climate positive action this decade. So as you see, our program is divided into what we call bookend plenaries. We'll start this morning with a context setting and give you a lot of food for thought. And that will be followed by 2 sets of breakout group discussions, and they will deal concurrently with 1, implementation challenges in the agriculture and fisheries sectors, and 2, with the finance sector's role in reaching Target 18. And then we'll all come back together, and the final closing plenary will bring the results of the breakout group to the larger group to develop recommendations for action. We are going to produce a paper from this event. And again, given the amazing luminaries in this room, I'm certain we're going to learn a great deal and make progress. So now let me invite Dr. Claude Gascon, the Director of Strategy and Operations of the Global Environment Facility, to welcome us on behalf of all the hosts.
Buenos dias todos y bienvenido. That's the extent of my Spanish. Otherwise, it turns into Spanish-Portuguese, which is not pretty. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues and distinguished guests, it's a pleasure for me to welcome you on behalf of the Government of Colombia, on behalf of the Secretary of the Convention of Biodiversity, and on behalf of the Global Environment Facility. I wish to thank all of our partners, and it's a long list. They are listed at the bottom of this slide. Just mentioned the Government of Colombia, the Convention of Biodiversity, Conservation International, the Nature Conservancy, the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, and the International Conservation Caucus Foundation. Without all of you over the past 6 months, we would not have come together and this conference would not have taken shape. As most of you know, the journey to address biodiversity loss has been fraught with challenges. More than a decade ago, global leaders set an ambitious goal to significantly reduce the rate of biodiversity loss by 2020. A recent assessment revealed that while some progress was made, none of the Aichi targets were fully achieved. Most notably, Aichi Target 3, which sought to reform harmful incentives, saw limited action, leaving a significant gap in our efforts. In light of these challenges, the adoption of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework 2 years ago marked a pivotal moment. This framework sets long-term goals and emphasizes the urgent need to eliminate or reform harmful incentives that drive a lot of biodiversity loss. Target 18 calls for a systemic approach to identify and phase out these detrimental subsidies with the ambition of reducing them by at least $500 billion per year by 2030. Today, we come together to explore how we can turn this vision into reality. The role of positive incentives cannot be overstated. They are essential for fostering a supportive environment for biodiversity conservation. By aligning our policies and financial flows, we can create a robust framework that not only halts biodiversity loss, but also promotes sustainable development. This conference is an opportunity to build a collective path forward. We'll hear from policymakers, stakeholders, and experts who will offer diverse perspectives on the actions necessary to achieve Target 18. Together, we will discuss the enabling conditions needed for effective transition finance, the specific challenges we face, and the roles different stakeholders can play. Our expected outcomes are ambitious but necessary. We aim to enhance recognition of the crucial interplay between harmful subsidies and positive incentives, provide guidance for future global environmental facility funding and programming, and by the way, we will embark in our replenishment negotiations, and the relevance of this conference is to be taken very seriously within that context. And we'll also lay the groundwork for ongoing collaboration among participating organizations. The discussions we will have today will inform future work to define a roadmap for all relevant stakeholders in achieving the vital Target 18. The GEF has already invested in this topic of policy coherence or policy reform. We have supported the International Conservation Caucus Foundation in their work in supporting governments all around the world. We've also created a policy coherence window in GEF 8, which allows the 5 biggest recipient countries of the GEF to develop projects that will then, in turn, advance the agenda of policy coherence in these countries. We're starting a collaboration with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to participate in country platforms to bring together climate and nature financing in key countries to align these donors to deliver common outcomes. As we engage in these conversations, let us remember that success requires not only high-level political will, but also a commitment from all levels of government and society. The task before us is significant, but together we can make strides towards a more sustainable and equitable future for biodiversity. Thank you for being here, for your dedication, and for your commitment to this essential cause. Let us work together to turn these aspirations into action and create a positive impact for generations to come. And I'd like to leave you with a war cry that I have put together based on a lot of what I've seen, but in principle, the leadership of our CEO in advancing this topic. Basically, we should be striving for nature-positive outcomes through nature-positive governance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claude, for that warm welcome on behalf of all our hosts and for gathering so many disparate but united in purpose people for this conference. We are united in making peace with nature. It is now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. Barry Gardiner, a member of Parliament for the UK government, having served in this capacity since 1997. Unusual longevity in politics. Mr. Gardner has worked to better align policies in the UK to both improve and then sustain environmental outcomes. So, Mr. Gardner, the podium is yours.
Good morning. I'm so happy to be with you amongst normal people. You see, I'm a politician, and I spend most of my time with other politicians. And they don't think like normal, sensible human beings. So today, I have a question. It's a question for the ministers of finance, for the treasury secretaries, the chancellors of the exchequer, the monetary policy makers, the guardians of the public purse. When the last forest has fallen to the chainsaw, when the last ocean has been choked with plastic, when the last fish has been caught, and the earth lies bare before you, is it only then that you'll understand how all your wealth was built upon nature, and that without nature, your money is but sand in your mouth? Economists talk as if the natural world is a subset of the economic one, something to be weighed and accounted for separately. In fact, the opposite is true. The economic world is a subset of the natural world. When did you last receive an invoice from a bee? You see, bees don't check whether the owner of the orchard has paid for their services, yet the value of insect pollination has been calculated at $153 billion a year. And that's just for the food that we eat directly, not for what we feed to our livestock. Pollination is a public good. It benefits everyone. It is there for us all. You know, economics does quite well in capturing the value of private goods, things that are not available to everyone to consume or enjoy, a car or a house. But they're pretty poor at capturing the value of pollination or clean air, because these are public goods. You can't exclude people from benefiting just because they haven't paid for them. Imagine if a forest presented you with an invoice. Trees filter our water supply. They regulate our temperature, they stabilize our soils, they protect us from floods, and they provide us with clouds and rainfall through transpiration. In the Amazon basin, 20 billion tons of water vapor pumped up into the atmosphere every single day, seeding our clouds with rain and quite literally making our weather. All for free. So let me take you on a journey through the mind of a politician. You see, for the politician, risk looks like this. For normal people, risk looks like this. The politician's obsessed with economic growth. And he looks at a river and he says, why isn't that straight? All these twists and turns, they're slowing the river traffic. If we straighten it out, we can get our goods to market quicker and increase our GDP. So in 1957, a group of American politicians did just that. This is them. All those politicians detonating the first blast of TNT to dig out a 76-mile-long straight canal. It was called the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet, MRGO, or as they called it locally, the Mr. Go channel. But take a closer look at what is behind them. No, not the big black column of debris and dust they've just blown up to dig the channel. Look closer at all the trees they've cut down. Trees? Ha! Don't worry about them, says the politician. They're only swamp cypress. They're worth nothing, and we've got millions of them. And that's where the politician's brain gets it wrong. Just because nobody will pay you for it doesn't mean it hasn't got a value. It's what economists call externalities, an indirect cost or benefit to somebody else that arises as an effect of your activity. Remember the bees. You see, classical economics treats the services that nature provides as externalities, things that we benefit from, but are neither responsible for nor have to pay for. And because of this, it fails to properly account either for the non-market benefits of ecosystems or for the damage to the environment that is done by what we call growth. All those trees and swamp were a beneficial externality. They were actually protecting the city of New Orleans. This is an image of what they looked like in 1932. And this is what they looked like 70 years later. The Mr. Go channel had changed the salinity of the water and destroyed the swamp cypress trees. And you know what happened next. Hurricane Katrina. 1,392 people died directly, and Katrina caused $125 billion worth of damage. But ironically, Katrina also boosted GDP, because GDP is a measure of economic activity, and following Katrina, there was an awful lot of economic activity, which just goes to show growth and wealth are not the same thing. So what have we learned so far? First, politicians don't think like normal people. Second, things can have a value even if nobody is paying for them. Third, the natural world can provide solutions to human-made problems. And four, economics only provides us with part of the picture. We need to value things properly. Not just GDP growth, but wealth. Not just dollars, but natural capital. In his review for the UK Treasury, Professor Partha Dasgupta set out a formula which he called impact inequality. So if GS represents the supply of nature, and NY over A represents the demands of that humanity puts on nature, then for economic development to be sustainable, Dasgupta argues the demands humanity puts on nature must match nature's ability to meet these demands. But when NY over A is greater than GS, then the world is in trouble. Okay, let's agree that maybe we're not all economists. Think of a bathtub. If our rate of consumption is the hole in the bath, and the planet's ability to regenerate and replenish all that we consume is the tap, then we need to make sure that our rate of consumption is not leaking out faster than nature is able to replenish. In other words, we need this. We don't need this. Or as Dasgupta put it, the demands humanity puts on nature must match nature's ability to meet those demands. They don't. Why? Why? Well, the why takes us right back to these guys, the politicians. You see, we politicians think we know what we want, and sometimes we do, but sometimes we don't realize that getting what we want in one area can mean not getting what we want in another. Mick Jagger had figured this out a long time ago. He told us, you can't always get what you want. Take fish. We like fish. Well, most of us do. Apologies to the vegetarians. And take fishermen. We like them too. And here's the problem. Because we like fishermen and we want them to vote for us, we've been helping them out to the tune of $22 billion globally. That's not the whole subsidy, that's just the amount that the WTO classes as harmful subsidy. So what is a harmful subsidy? It's the subsidy that actually ends up depleting the number of fish available for the next fisherman to catch. It is $22 billion of incentives to overfish and exhaust our fish stocks beyond their ability to regenerate. And that's why the WTO has created their agreement on fishery subsidies. The WTO agreement was adopted at the 12th Ministerial Conference in June 22, specifically to prohibit certain forms of fisheries subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, and to eliminate subsidies that contribute to IUU fishing. Here are the countries that have signed up to it. Trouble is, signing up to it and implementing it are very different things. It's the difference between being and doing. And perverse subsidies can be provided in all sorts of different ways. They can be direct grants or indirect allowances. They can be fiscal incentives or tax breaks. They can even be by providing cheaper electricity or fuel. But all perverse subsidies have one thing in common. They do more harm than good by ignoring the value of public goods and externalities. Sometimes they even do it for the very best of motives. Let's stick with fish for a moment. A few years ago, the European Union were worried that fish stocks were overexploited. They still are. Fishermen were complaining that stocks had declined, and so they came up with a scheme to reduce the number of fishing vessels. Some fishermen even said they wanted to retire. So the EU offered to pay them to scrap their old fishing boats. It was a great success. Lots of fishermen took the money. The trouble was, many of them used the money to buy a more modern boat. The modern vessel promptly went out and caught more fish than the old vessel could ever have done. And the fishermen were very happy, but the politicians couldn't understand how their plan had backfired. You see, the policy was totally incoherent. The fishermen who scrapped their boats still held their quota. Many of them were happy to retire and put their feet up, but if they'd no sons to pass their quota on to, they simply leased their quota out to other fishermen. Millions of euros were paid to enable fishermen to overfish with even greater capacity. That's the politicians' clever use of subsidy. Sadly, we don't just have perverse subsidies in the fishing industry. They exist in forestry, in agriculture, in energy. The OECD and the International Energy Agency did a survey of 77 countries in which they identified $478 billion of environmentally damaging subsidies each year to the fossil fuel sector alone. But I suspect they didn't include this place on their list. Drax Power Station, in England. The company has claimed almost $7 billion from British taxpayers to support its biomass generation since 2012, even though burning wood pellets for power generation releases more emissions per unit of electricity generated than burning gas or coal. It produces 4% of the UK's power, and for 14 years, the previous UK government maintained that it was carbon neutral because the forests were replanted and they absorbed as much carbon over the cycle as they released. Now, in the opposition, as of a few months ago, the former Energy Secretary has just admitted 2 weeks ago that this was never true and that she realized the trees didn't grow back quickly enough to help stop climate change. In the meantime, £7 billion, that's about $9 billion of public money, has been spent making our air pollution and our carbon emissions worse. More than that, Drax has been responsible for destroying parts of the most precious old-growth virgin forests in Canada, where some of the biomass pellets have come from. Each of us will have a particular favorite story of policy incoherence. You know, it's not that politicians set out to damage the environment. Of course we don't. Often perverse subsidies start as a way of helping a particular disadvantaged group or to boost production in a certain sector of industry. But once a subsidy is established, it's very difficult to abolish. Interest groups often work to prevent their removal or even to increase them. This is especially true when the subsidy helps a particularly narrow group of people at the expense of the wider public good. Take the North Sea basin around my country, the UK. My government will tell you that we don't subsidize the oil and gas industry. What they mean is we don't give them a big bag of cash, but we do charge them lower tax than any other country in the world. In fact, at 38% basic tax on industry, we charge the lowest fiscal rate anywhere. The global average is 74%. Then there are tax deductibles. When Mr. Sunak was our chancellor, he wanted to try to encourage business, and so he gave all companies an incentive to do research and development. No, the incentive was not a bottle of beer, although you'd be forgiven that he might have been drunk when setting the policy. But the incentive was a 130% super tax deductible. I remember talking to him about it at the time. He told me that the idea was to boost productivity, and it was doing exactly what he wanted. Look, I said, hey, I agree with the intention. But I asked why he hadn't put a green filter on it. I explained that if the Cambo oil field were to go ahead in the North Sea, it wouldn't be Shell or Sycar paying for that development, but the British taxpayer, who would pay the full costs, although they had no share in the profits. And that we would be giving the companies then a 30% bonus on top. Without batting an eyelid, he told me, as I said, Barry, it's doing precisely what I intended. Well, it might have been what he intended, but it meant that oil and gas extraction that would otherwise have been uneconomic could now go ahead. And that was totally against the government's own commitments on net zero. The subsidy policy was incoherent. And you do see what's happened here. There was a public asset, the oil and gas reserves, which a license to exploit turned into a private asset, followed by a public subsidy, which paid for the costs of that exploitation, which produced millions of tons of emissions, which damaged the public good, and went against our treaty commitment to phase out oil and gas, to make profit for private shareholders at the double expense of the public. According to the WWF's Living Planet report, which was published just this month, vertebrate populations have declined by an average of 73% since 1970, a stark indicator of the accelerating biodiversity crisis. The fact is that if we're going to halt that decline, protect genetic diversity, avoid tipping points in the global ecosystem, and begin to meet the goals of the GBF, we must address the way we account for nature, change our measures of economic success, and transform our institutions and systems. For over 70 years, GDP has been the primary measure of economic success. In fact, it's no such thing. It's simply a measure of economic activity. It doesn't measure productive capacity. Critically, it ignores the depreciation of assets, and key amongst these is the depreciation of the natural environment. A focus on GDP encourages us to pursue unsustainable economic development, which we mistakenly call growth. Through perverse subsidies, most governments pay people more to exploit nature than to protect it. They change the price users pay for the global commons from zero to a negative. Instead, we should focus on our economy's portfolio of capital, by which I mean our produced capital of plant and infrastructure, our human capital, education, judicial systems, and our natural capital. This would provide us with a measure not of activity, but of what Dasgupta calls inclusive wealth. You see, we use nature because it is valuable. We abuse nature because it is free. The failure to properly value nature leads to short-sighted decision-making and allows perverse subsidies to damage the global ecosystem. Target 18 of the GBF says that by next year, we must identify, eliminate, phase out, or reform incentives and subsidies that are harmful for nature. We've got to reduce them by at least 500 billion a year. Now, our hosts here in Colombia have designated this CBD as the Peace COP. So I want to leave you with one final thought. If you want peace, create justice. If you want justice, live sustainably. Thank you.
Well deserving that wild applause, Mr. Gardner. I'm going to thank you for that sobering message, rendered so cogently and with great but really frightening visuals. You really made it real, and you crystallized what we all must do today. You know, you remind me of how the children's books, the Lorax, got it right by Dr. Seuss. And let's hope that this conference finds those truthful seeds before it's too late. We can't continue taking everything, everywhere, all at once on the land and sea. And as imperfect as GDP certainly is, at least 44 trillion, or half of it, is based on nature, even using imperfect measures. So thank you so much for setting the stage so well. And I would now like to invite our 5 high-level panel members to come to the stage, and I'll introduce you as you come up. So first we have Mr. Prasad, who is the Unit Chief of the Climate Finance Policy Unit at the International Monetary Fund. And aside from leading the IMF on climate finance, he has published books and many articles on macroeconomics and climate finance issues. Welcome, Mr. Prasad. Next, we have Eva Zabe, who is the CEO of Business for Nature. And Ms. Zabe brings decades of experience working with the private sector on sustainability, on driving natural capital approaches and accounting, on policy ambition and more, and was formally trained in the environment. Next, we have Ms. Patrizia Zurita. She is the Chief Strategy Officer at Conservation International. And Ms. Zurita has spent her professional life in the not-for-profit world, and until recently headed the largest alliance of conservation organizations in the world, BirdLife. And last but not least, oh no, second last but not least, Mr. Carlos Correa, who is now a senior fellow at Conservation International and also co-chair of the World Economic Forum's expert task force on nature-positive cities. Mr. Correa previously served as Colombia's Minister for Environment and Sustainable Development, where he actively advanced climate action, biodiversity conservation, and carbon markets. Welcome, Mr. Correa. And now, last but not least, I invite Dr. Valerie Hickey, who is the Global Director for Environment at the World Bank. And originally, she came from the NGO world, but she brings real world visibility to the work of the World Bank and has championed the importance of a healthy environment as an underpinning to the work of the development agencies writ large, but of course, including the World Bank. And so as we promised, this group of experts represents a diverse set of stakeholders from the executive branch of governments to public financing to the private sector and civil society. And as we heard from our keynote speaker, each of these sectors has an important role to play in the implementation and delivery of the Target 18 outcomes. So in order to try to get a few rounds of questions in, we've asked each person to answer my questions briefly in 2 or 3 minutes. We'll see if there's time for a follow-up and maybe a last lightning round even. So. Let's see if that works. Okay, so why don't we start by examining the role of public financing and policy reforms in transforming, if you will, the incentive landscape of national and international financing to get towards this nature positive, climate positive vision. So maybe a first question for you, Mr. Prasad, at the IMF. I mean, it's certainly, the IMF plays a really key role in maintaining global financial stability and fostering international cooperation and recognition, and it recognizes the role of climate change and how it's affecting macroeconomic stability. So I think the first question would be, how does the IMF ensure that its work can deliver positive environmental outcomes writ large?
Thank you very much, and thank you to the GEF for the invitation. Well, after Mr. Barry Gardner, after his eloquence, it's extremely difficult to come and say something, which is compelling or equal. Forget equal, but even to give the message across. But I hope that the work in the IMF and what we are doing is enough to tell its story. So the IMF has a role to play in helping members address the challenges of environment, for which fiscal, financial, macroeconomic policies are important components of the policy response. So we are there because climate and nature are macro critical. So let me also give you some numbers. We just published a paper on nature-related economic and financial risks. And we are citing numbers that there are $1.7 trillion worth of subsidies. These are harmful subsidies. These are driven by fossil fuel. 640 billion of these subsidies are from energy. 520 billion in agriculture, $350 billion in water, 155 in forestry, and 50 billion in fisheries. This is one set of numbers to give you the magnitude of the problem. We also did some analysis on the financial system and the risk in the financial system. So we found that for the 100 largest global banks, 38% of bank loans are extended to harmful subsidies sector. So there is a risk sitting there, and if we are to meet the targets of reducing subsidy over years, there is a transition risk that needs to be managed. 44% of these 100 global banks' loans are exposed to conservation areas under GBF. And we also found that industries most exposed to natural degradation are not well prepared to manage these risks. This is the enormity of the task that we are facing. So we in the IMF are stepping up across all operations. In our surveillance, where we go and give recommendations to all the 192 members we have, we tailor policy advice covering mitigation, adaptation, transition issues. Our financial sector assessments include climate risks related to regulation and supervision. We also help countries improve their capacity on many areas in national budgeting, in investments, in data, in disclosures, and taxonomies. These are all extremely critical things, because at the end of it, if there are huge financing needs and financing requirements of these countries, you need both the public and private sector to come in, and all the management of the investments that might come in are important. And finally, in our debt sustainability assessments, we have issued guidance on how to reflect these risks from extreme weather events and long-term shifts in climate. Now, I just wanted to get into a couple of things. We recently established the Resilience and Sustainability Trust that was created out of reallocation of members, what we call special drawing rights that we had issued to them. We created a trust out of $48 billion, and we are giving money, long-term money, to countries who have vulnerabilities in climate, and we give money for 20 years with 10.5 years grace period, and we give this money at very low interest rates. So any vulnerable country which is either a middle income or even high income, like Barbados, for instance, or the Caribbean countries, or low income countries in Africa, are eligible for this. And this comes with some conditions, and these conditions are expected to help these countries slowly use this money that we give as budget financing to help create innovative solutions to increase their public and private sector financing. But this money that we give is only a small fraction of the climate-related financing. So we use our convening strength along with the World Bank and other multilateral development banks to bring together governments, multilateral development banks, institutions like the Global Environment Facility to foster and increase climate finance. And my last point for this round is that we are committed to serving the membership with the high demand for this money through the Resilience and Sustainability Facility. We will continue to use our convening strength to crowd in additional financing. At the same time, we recognize that each country faces a different set of challenges. So the time required for the necessary diagnostics, identifying reforms, and providing adequate capacity will vary. But we are also positioned to help coordinate a broad and holistic initiative to mobilize both domestic resources as well as external resources, along with all the other partners, both the public sector, the private sector, the donors, and the multilateral development banks, to have public-private partnerships and scale up climate finance. Thank you.
Well, the Resilience and Sustainability Fund sounds just amazing and wonderful. Very hard to get things that go for 20 years, and very exciting. But as you have said, you're just one of many lenders in a country. So could I just ask a fast follow-up question? How can you actually ensure that your work and the work of those other funders are moving in a complementary way, the policy coherence idea?
Thank you. So Claude just mentioned in his opening welcome address about country platforms. What is very critical here is that you need country-owned initiatives so that the others can come in for financing. So far we have given money to 20 countries under the RSF. We have committed $9 billion and we have disbursed around $3 billion. So in 10 of these countries, what we are doing is we are using our convening strength to bring all partners around the table to discuss with the government. This enables the government to bring interministerial coordination. We find that different institutions are dealing with different ministries in the government, so you need a platform called a country platform to bring in interministerial coordination so that the budget speaks to environment and they speak to planning, because you need projects. And then we try to use funds in a creative way. For instance, if GEF is grant-based financing, how can you use that creatively to use that grant as equity financing so that you can leverage that money 5 times, 10 times? The World Bank has a guarantee facility now, which is a common platform. How can you use those guarantee facility along with public funding so that you leverage and do not impair the debt sustainability in a country? So we think of innovative solutions. We think of moving from project level investments to programmatic level investments. We are thinking of risk sharing. We are thinking of de-risking, and we are thinking of interministerial coordination. So we think that that's the way to go. Countries do not have the capacity to set up their own country platforms. So we need to help them establish the country platforms first, and then over time, in 6 months or 12 months, they may build capacity to take it on their own and run. Yeah.
Very interesting, very forward-thinking, very innovative. It seems that we should go from there to ask a former Minister of the Environment a question. And so, Mr. Correa, you were Minister of the Environment, and you must have faced challenges with government policies that might not have always aligned with the interests of the environment. And how did you deal with those challenges?
Well, thank you, Rosina. Definitely, politicians don't think like normal people, Mr. Gardner. And they also love to make announcements. And they cannot answer in 2.5 minutes. So I'm going to try. So I was just, remembering Glasgow 2021, COP26, climate, and we were so excited. Carlos Manuel, you were there. Christian, Patricia. So we were so happy, and President Duque, because we were going to announce the 30 before 30. Colombia was going to do it 8 years before the goal. So we were happy. And then we made the announcement, and then we made the announcement of the declaration of the Eastern Pacific Corridor. So everyone was so excited about this. But my colleagues were not. So when I got back to Colombia, they were so mad at me. The Minister of Energy, the Minister of Agriculture, the Minister of Trade, they were like, Carlos, what are you doing, man? And why 8 years earlier? I say, well, because we can do it. We have the data, we have the science, we have the political will from the president, because we need political will, not only just the will to make an announcement. We need the political will from the head of state, President Duque at that time, I was a minister, and then my team was, very committed to this goal. So that was hard, to sit there and make them realize how important it was to protect Colombia, the second most biodiverse country in the world. At that time, we only had around 14% of our oceans and land as a protected area. So we did it in 1 year, but we did it, working together as a collective purpose. It was not easy because, the Minister of Energy was thinking about energy security, as you just said, the reserves of oil and gas. 50% of the income of my country comes from oil and gas. But we could negotiate. So that's an example of that transversal, management. When you are the Minister of the Environment, you are like the stone on the road, always. You have the lowest budget. 0.4% of the budget was my budget. But we had another kind of, budget. And that's an example, Rosina, of what we did at that time, working together, not only with the sectors, but also with the communities, with the private sector, with the science sector. The Science Academy was a very good support. And then in Lisbon in 2022, we announced the declaration of the 37.5% of our oceans as a protected areas, and the 31% of our continental areas as protected areas. So we did it 8 years before. It was not easy. We had to make very hard decisions, but there was the political will, the data, the knowledge. It was not only from the lungs, an announcement, and today Colombia did it, and we still, trying to promote this. The 30 before 30. If Colombia did it, if Costa Rica did it, we can do it. And that's what this COP is about. We have to do it, and we need the resources to do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I mean, political will, leadership, partnerships, all amazingly demonstrated in what you just said. I mean, do you have advice for what more broadly national governments can do to actually close this enormous financing gap by reforming incentives and reducing subsidies in your other 2.5 minutes?
What I think is that we have to work together. We need partnership, definitely, and we need to bring together all the budgets from different from the different sectors and do this collective action. And one example, another example was the NDCs updated in 2020. Colombia updated at that time. We announced our update on December in 2020, and our commitment was to decrease emissions by 51% by 2030. 196 actions. So the first question from my colleagues was, and where's the money? Where's the money to do that? And I said, okay, let's come together and put all these commitments together and see how much do we need for this. So two things at that time that I think that were, the principal issues that we worked on. First, we announced the NDCs. Second, we presented a law in the Congress, the Climate Action Law. So we brought that 196 actions that we committed into the law. So we needed the money and the political will to do that. From the Congress, from the presidents, from the ministers. And then a third one that is my recommendation is that we did at that time, led by President Duque and the Minister of Environment, It was the Climate Action Cabinet. So after we presented the law, we created this cabinet with all the ministers from the different sectors that had commitments with the NDCs, seated there once a month, led by the president, and following up each one of those actions. So what I recommend countries is to work, together, to sit together, to have the political will, but sit together to get the funds. And then you can talk about subsidies, about how to do it, about how much time do we need to do it, because sometimes you cannot do it just in one day, but you need times, you need timeline, and then those kind of actions were really good achievements for the government. Now the Climate Action Cabinet is not working anymore, but I think that governments should launch and build this kind of cabinets to work together for this achievement, and of course, Target 18. Thank you.
That's a great idea. And of course, as you should applaud. A great idea to have a cabinet member. And the other thing is, you correctly pointed out that the NDCs, or the nationally determined commitments, need to be updated next year. And very few of them include money in them, the need for adaptation or the cost to protect natural resources. So that can be a helpful forcing function along the way too. So we haven't exhausted the public sector, although in its financing certainly can be a tool to change or maybe even transform the incentive landscape. But let's move now to the private sector. And appropriately, the private sector seems to be increasingly concerned with the degradation of nature and the impact on, for example, its supply chains and truly the financial bottom line. And so let's now turn to Eva Zabe, who is the CEO of Business for Nature. And so, Eva, businesses are also the recipients, either directly or indirectly, of the environmentally harmful subsidies. So why is it important from an economic perspective and your view to reform those subsidies?
Well, thank you so much. It's really great to be here and to have this conversation. Well, 100% of the economy depends on nature, what we just heard. It's not only half of the GDP that's dependent, it's half the GDP that's moderately or highly at risk from nature loss, but the whole economy depends on nature. So that means that you can't have a business on a dead planet without a healthy planet. Companies are starting really, and over the past few years, I hope you've also seen this increase of awareness and understanding of companies recognizing their impacts and dependencies on nature, and that's fantastic. They're starting to take more action, but there's one massive barrier to that corporate action, which is that the economic system rewards short-term profit over long-term value creation. And so essentially, unintentionally, we need to remember this, it's unintentional, but unintentionally we're incentivizing and we're rewarding businesses to overexploit instead of supporting the transition. For businesses, in fact, the environmentally harmful subsidies distort prices, they skew resource allocation, they actually create unfair competition and they also, for businesses, create a potential reputational risk. So continuing, if we continue this cycle of dependency, because it is a cycle of dependency that is being created, it just makes it harder and harder to shift to better new solutions. There is, though, alongside the risk, there's an opportunity here, though, which is that we can, if we reform environmentally harmful subsidies, we will create new investment opportunities, we'll create new jobs, we'll increase the resilience of business models, because the this reform would free up all of these other government resources that are available, and they would send signals to investors. So there's this like positive feedback loop instead of being a negative feedback loop. Importantly, it's the policy and this landscape that helps level the playing field for companies. And that political certainty, that direction, will give confidence then to business and investors to act at scale and speed towards nature positive outcomes. I think what's really interesting is to see over the past few years an increase in the advocacy role that businesses can play. And in the run-up to COP15, Business for Nature, the coalition that I lead, all came together, and I see Farouk in the room there, the B team, many other partners came together, Capitals Coalition. We all came together to call for a very ambitious target 18, and we focused on a lot of the research, and we were welcoming this. But we're seeing also, for example, a Fossil to Clean campaign that has hundreds of companies supporting it. There are investor statements to the G20 finance ministers that are calling for the repurposing of agricultural subsidies. And so there is an elevation of the issue. We've moved from EHS being a bit of a taboo topic, to be honest, 5 years ago, now with GBF being, okay, yeah, right, we're talking about, we need to really get organized, because for business, this is a strategic issue, being so dependent on environmentally harmful subsidies, not even knowing where or how you benefit from them. So let's dig into this and ensure that, bottom line is EHS is a strategic issue for business.
So thank you so much for that. I mean, it's absolutely clear you need a policy landscape that is supporting where you want to go. But the policymakers need signals from the private sector that this is where they need to go too. And so as you think about, the dozens of exciting new initiatives, do you have a thought on how it can all kind of add up, how the private sector's role in both policy reform and subsidy reform can actually lead to what we hope will be transformational, nature positive, climate positive outcomes?
Yeah. Well, clearly, as was said before, this is we need all stakeholders to be part of this collaboration, although I do think that government is in the lead, and that business and finance have a disproportionately influential role to play, and there's a lot of responsibility that comes with that, and we should be using that because it is part of that transformation. So going back to that point that I was just saying before, is that businesses have a strategic blind spot if they don't know how they are benefiting from these subsidies and other forms of incentives. So there are two things I think that companies can really focus on right now. Number one is they need to map their own dependencies. They need to go into, interestingly, when we talk and our partners talk with companies, even the big ones, they won't be sure exactly. If you say, yeah, you depend on environmentally harmful subsidies. Oh, really? We don't know where, because it's not a classic thing that you can just see it on a balance sheet somewhere. You have to dig into, you got a tax break from that. Oh yeah, you got the permit for that. It's not actually as obvious as it may seem. So the first thing is to understand and map where these subsidies are coming from. And the second big thing that businesses need to do is to advocate and collaborate, be part of this transition. Use not only their engagement with governments, but their trade associations. How can we bump those along and then be part of these advocacy groups to be bold, to be part of this transformation, because that's the only way we will reach a nature positive, net zero and equitable world.
Thank you for both enlightening us and giving us encouraging responses to the way forward. And I think you have appropriately led into the role of stakeholders in this. And so maybe civil society, which absolutely has to be mobilized to help for this common goal, it would be good to ask Patrizia Zarita, who is the Chief Strategy Officer at Conservation International, about the role that you see that civil society can play in persuading, in supporting, in actively encouraging public and private sector actions and adoption of policies that deliver these positive environmental outcomes and reform harmful policies.
Thank you so much, Rosina. And thank you, Carlos Manuel and the Jeff team, for hosting us. It's so encouraging to see so many of you interested, but all of the people who have registered for this session, we had over 300 people signing up for this. When we started the conversation about we need to get moving on Target 18, we were not quite sure that we were gonna get so much interest, so it's really great to see so many of you here and also the people who are going to be coming in and out the sessions later today. As you know, I'm from Conservation International, so what is a conservation organization trying to do on subsidy reform, you would ask? One thing that we haven't really talked about yet is that the gap of financing nature is about $700 billion, or at least $700 billion a year. And as Barry so eloquently said, and Prasad, your numbers as well, we have at least $500 billion in subsidies, if not more, that are actually destroying nature. So when Barry, when you were showing your bathtub with your beautiful frog there, this is exactly the way that I actually convinced Sanjan, our CEO, that we had to get involved in this. You have a bathtub and think about not the use of resources of nature, but rather the amount of funding that we're putting to nature. You think about that bathtub of financing, and then you have a hole, the subsidies hole, that is actually going to destroy nature. It doesn't matter how big the droplets of funding that we're giving nature are, because we're never going to be able to close that gap to really help conserve, restore, and protect nature in the way that it needs to be so we can survive and we can be wealthy. So this is the reason why we're involved. But Rosina, you asked what is the role of civil society in all of this? Yes, absolutely. We need the politicians, we need the governments, we need the private sector, we need the banks, we need the financial markets really backing up this mission. What the civil society does is brings the actors together, helps channel that data, socialize that data, make sure, I mean, you were talking about your partners. Your business partners don't know where the subsidies are coming from or how they're actually helping them destroy nature. How can we, as the civil society, bring and broker these conversations and bring all these actors to the table? Because we have to remember, I mean, you said it so well, once a subsidy is in, reforming it is so hard because there's people who are benefiting from them. And the reality is that subsidies were designed to benefit the most vulnerable populations. That was the reason why they were designed. There was a very important and positive outcome that we wanted out of subsidies. Over the years, things have gone wrong and we haven't fixed them and corrected them. And this is the time. We don't have more time. We need to do it now. So the purpose of all of this conversation and the role that civil society can play is precisely bringing all these actors together so we can identify who are the winners right now, who are the losers, and when, if we can actually reform them into incentives that are supporting nature conservation, restoration, protection, sustainable agriculture, sustainable fisheries, who are then going to be the winners and the losers. So then we can broker that conversation and help the tension of this subsidy reform to lessen so we can actually make progress.
It was very interesting the way you put it. You know, I think in many projects and programs, when they're formed, civil society is underattended to. And, you know, I think there's a big role for civil society to play in the government, in the private sector, in translating what we, the technical community, put out. That's not easy to translate. And then to do that kind of safe and comfortable convening across the sectors. Very interesting. Could you say a few words about maybe how Conservation International has worked with international or national partners to support policy reform and make it concrete for us?
Yes, so first of all, you know, we don't have the magic wand. I wish we do. But what we are intending to do is, as I said before, bring the partners together, bring the different stakeholders, bring the governments, bring the private sector, bring the local fishers, the local farmers, the associations of farmers, and really think about the financial markets and the banks, and really think about how can we have this conversation in the right way. We are incredibly grateful to the support of the Global Environment Facility. We have just created what we call the ARTSI, that is it's an initiative to accelerate rapid transition to subsidies and incentives. And the intention is precisely to get these conversations going, identified pilots in key countries where we can sit down with the different stakeholders and have this conversation. You know, the biggest problem, I think the way that I convinced Claude that we can actually have this happening was by saying, you know, the biggest problem for subsidy reform and Target 18 is that everyone thinks that is incredibly difficult. So no one wants to touch it. It's really hard. We don't want to get involved. We're not going to win this one. But unless we start building up this momentum, this right energy, that it is possible, and there are hundreds of examples around the world, very, very much so in Colombia or in India, and examples for positives, but also examples for negatives happening right now. I mean, I don't know if you guys know, but 3 days ago, the governor of Mato Grosso started to lifting up the moratorium on soy production. And for those companies who are really committed to not destroying the Amazon and to protecting while producing soy production, the governor came and said, if you guys say something about this, I take the incentive that we're paying you for protecting the forest out. So subsidies can actually be incredibly powerful for positive work, but they can be incredibly harmful, and we're seeing the impact that is having on nature. So our role and what we are doing right now is, you know, first, making this incredibly visible, sharing the data, sitting down with a handful of pilots and countries and governments and actors from the private sector and saying, okay, let's crack this. Let's do it in a way that we can start building up these good momentum and energy to understand that this is possible, and that we can start having the accomplishment of Target 18 and the implementation of Target 18 as soon as possible, because nature needs it and we need it.
Well, we certainly, yeah. It's really clear that civil society has a pivotal role to play in this agenda. And we hope all that momentum in those pilots really develop very quickly so that it can, if you will, you know, snowball, since we see the timeline of 2025 and 2030 is upon us. And in particular, I would say, you know, we shouldn't undervalue the enthusiasm and interest of youth as we think about mobilizing civil society. And so Valerie, let's turn to you now. The World Bank has long worked with countries on the development agenda and exists to create a world free of poverty on a livable planet. So how does the bank approach the management of the inevitable trade-offs between people and the planet?
Thank you, Rosina. I thought you were coming to me as a young person. I was really excited there for a minute. No such luck. So indeed, our mission is to end poverty on a livable planet. And I have to say, sadly, that it's never been a harder thing to do, because the planet's on fire and it's underwater and the countries have no money to do anything about it. And I think that's the first thing we do when we think about subsidies and the trade-offs, because there are trade-offs. And I'm so glad to hear from Patricia, to hear from Barry and others that this isn't easy, because the first thing we do at the World Bank is try and have an honest discussion around subsidies. Because it's very easy to make out that subsidies are all about making rich already evil fat cats. And there may be some of that, but the truth is they were set up to help the poor, and they still help the poor. We all talk about agricultural subsidies, we know the numbers. We know the 635 billion a year that's spent on explicit subsidies, so actual money put on the table for agricultural subsidies, are directly responsible for 14% of global deforestation, for an area being cut the size of Belize every year. We know that. We also know that, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, most of those agricultural subsidies are given in the form of fertilizer support. And we even know more than that. We know that for every 10% increase in fertilizer put on the land across sub-Saharan Africa leads to less than 3% increase in production, while it also leads to a 3.5% decrease in labor productivity. because those men and women who are spreading the fertilizer and their kids who are on their back when they do it are getting sick, because most of that nitrogen fertilizer is being washed into the water they're drinking, or it's being aerosolized. We all know that. We have to be honest about that. But the other piece of this honesty is, you would think the easy answer then is, let's stop doing that. But that 3%, almost 3% increase in food production doesn't sound like a lot, but it's the difference between putting food on the table for most of those farmers and not. So we have to be honest that the discussion around subsidies is not easy. And that's why the second thing we do when we think about the trade-offs is we have to get the data right. Too much of the discussion on subsidies remains at the political level, remains at the global aggregate level. Even Target 18, the $500 billion number, it's not clear if we're talking about implicit or explicit subsidies. Probably half of us in the room don't know the difference between an implicit and explicit subsidy. We have to start getting the data right, and more importantly, we have to move away from the discussion around the big political numbers and talk about the numbers on the ground for the governments. And we have to put the data on the table that's relevant to decision makers, and we have to put it on the table in the decision-making frameworks they have. So ministries of environment, it's not just that they're the least paid, they're the least often asked for their input when it comes to economic decision-making. In part because environmental data is not usually included in the accounts that ministers of finance or ministries of planning have. So until we begin to put environmental data into the institutional data of countries and governments so that it is on their balance sheets, we're never going to have an honest discussion with the real data that's relevant to governments on the table. So that's the second thing we have to do. And then the third thing, and we're not talking about this enough, is we need to make sure the right people are at the table for these discussions. And to be honest, all of us here are not the right people. If we're honest about what subsidies do and who they help, and we're honest about the actual numbers and the challenge of these trade-offs, and the fact that, to be honest, governments want to stop giving subsidies. Most low-income governments across sub-Saharan Africa today spend more repaying their debt than they have to spend on education and health put together. So they're desperate to find ways to reduce their investments, to save money. So they would like to stop these subsidies. But we don't want to end up in a situation where we go from giving subsidies that lead to 14% increase in deforestation to giving subsidies that lead to people starving to death. There's already 49 million people starving to death. We don't need more. So we can't go from one bad outcome to another, and the only way to stop that is to get the right people around the table. It means making sure indigenous peoples are at the table, because they are managing or stewarding much of this land where the subsidies are having an impact, for better or for worse. It means getting small-scale farmers at the table, or small-scale fishers. It's not just about big business and big conservation. It's about local NGOs. It's about local academia, who often have the numbers that matter, numbers that are real for decisions that need to be made in the moment. So for us, Rosine, I think the three big things are having that honest discussion, building it on real numbers and numbers that matter at the local level, and being put in a way that can actually be part of the chain of decision-making in countries, and making sure our job is to get the right people around the table and making sure they have the capacity when they're at the table to have their interests heard.
Thank you so much. As a scientist, hearing that we need data makes me really happy. And you know how important it is. We've talked about, you know, valuing nature, so that's showing up on the balance sheets, but we also need to understand both the trade-offs, as you said, and also the potential co-benefits of doing things for the environment, because we often don't value the ancillary actions like improved health that you mentioned, improved livelihoods too. So given what you've laid out, could you give us a couple of examples of successes, or if you dare, failures of the World Bank trying to meet these twin goals of you know, reducing poverty and being on a livable planet?
2 minutes isn't enough to go on the apology tour that the World Bank needs to do, because quite frankly, we've been a huge part of the problem. And that we've actually, interestingly enough, sort of jumped from putting in economy first to environment first, and neither one has worked particularly well yet. I mean, as an institution for decades, the answer to every question was growth, and more growth, and growth at any cost. And it meant our economic models, in which we, together with the IMF, sit at the table with ministers of finance every day to show them what every single policy action they make, what difference it'll make on growth. The only way it took environment into account was when it was on the back of a truck or in the back of a boat. Standing tree meant nothing. And that was incredibly wrong. And until the last few years, we were using those same models. We finally, in the last 5 years, updated those models to take climate emissions into account. We're now updating those models to take ecosystem services into account. So a government will see its policy action, what impact it will have on growth, immediate growth, GDP growth, but also on its long-term wealth. And that wealth, as Barry said, is so critical. We just came out with a report, The Changing Wealth of Nations. It's a useful report if you want to read it. Parts of it are quite dense, but the executive summary is interesting because it basically tells the story over the last 25 years, from 2009 to 2024, that yes, growth has increased and wealth per capita has increased. It's horribly distributed. All of sub-Saharan Africa holds less than 2% of global wealth. Really? Given their youth dividend, given the natural capital they have? But yeah, that's the numbers. And what's worse, what it's telling us is most of that wealth per capita has come at the expense of natural capital per capita, because while human capital has grown only by 9% per capita in the last 25 years. So the old excuse that it's okay and important to cut down the trees and fish all the fish out of the sea is because what it means is people will have better health, they'll have access to better hospitals, they'll be able to go to better schools, and they can all come work for the World Bank and have good jobs, and who cares if there are trees standing? Nope, that's not working. It hasn't been translated, because while we've only had a 9% increase per capita in human capital development, we've seen a 20% decrease in natural capital per capita. That math isn't good. That math won't work. And so that's something that we're changing, the economic models on which we're giving daily advice to governments. But the other mistake we made on the other side of the spectrum, and this is equally important, and we're equally apologetic for it, is what I call the Thanos problem. Anyone here who watches the Avengers, you know, needs to do something. There's somebody in the back at least understands what I'm talking about. But they're great movies. They, you know, chewing gum for the mind. They're highly entertaining. But it's this idea that we would put environment first at the expense of people, and especially the people who steward the environment. So for decades, when we finally did get involved in conservation and finally did help, for example, on protected area management, we threw some crumbs at the local communities and indigenous peoples who live there. We call it the sort of component 3 problem. Let them do a little bit of beekeeping and basket weaving. We really don't care about them. We care about the environment. And so people, the 3 billion people today who live within 1 kilometer of a forest, who depend on that forest as their social safety net, are the poorest people on the planet. That's also because of decisions we've made. Decisions to put environment above people. So we can't have either one. We can't say grow at any cost, and we can't say conserve at any cost. We have to find ways to manage those trade-offs and make sure the people at the table who are making the decisions are the ones who ultimately live with them. That's not us at the World Bank. It's the communities, it's the small farmers and small fishermen, it's the indigenous peoples, it's the local politicians. They're the people who have to live with the consequences. They're the people who have to navigate the trade-offs.
Thank you. And while I actually didn't think of you as the youth representative, I think your comments, though, represent the concerns of the youth. And thank you for bringing up the Avengers, which I think somebody in the audience actually got. And I think, you know, you're absolutely correct that we are all not here on stage, or even not all here in the audience. But my hope is that our networks can connect the networks to achieve what we're talking about today. And I think being such a terrifying moderator has kept you all to your time limits. And we actually do have time for a lightning round, which could go berserk, but we'll try. And I mean, we haven't, we've barely tapped into the incredible expertise of this panel. But I wonder if, we might give you each a chance to say, potentially in 1 minute, what you found particularly compelling, or what you need from these other stakeholders on stage to achieve this transformational change we're trying to get in 2025 and 2030 on Target 18. And so since we've had you sit so quietly, Mr. Prasad, I think you get to go first again.
Thank you. So what I learned, from this panel and discussions is that both policies and financing are important. So we need all hands on the deck. So we need public-private partnership, we need risk sharing, and we need to help countries with their capacity to make sure that you get all actors on the stage and you continue to persevere with the efforts across the whole government instead of targeting one particular ministry to take this forward.
So policy coherence.
Thanks so much. I think building on, we need the radical collaboration, which is a buzzword, but it is actually true. And businesses, it's not going to work without each of the actors, but it's also not going to work if business is not ready to be part of that transformation and give its own confidence to say, yes, we want to also transition away and reform to more positive outcomes. So I feel like what we need is this sense of not only courage and confidence, but this kind of motto that's in my head is that today's self-inflicted pain needs to go towards tomorrow's long-term gain, and that is something that only works if we all have a coordinated plan to get there.
Just a couple of things from me. One, I think we have to realize that there's a lot more interest in these than we thought there was, and not only from the conservation community that is after Target 18, but from the private sector, from the public sector. The report that the World Bank put out this spring, for example, is just an extraordinary indication that we're moving in the right direction, number one. I would say number two, as you said it, we need the right actors at the table, but that needs careful process thinking of how do we bring these actors to the table. So how do we help, a coffee farmer in the Huila understand how their subsidy is going to change because now we want them to be participating and is choosing to do conservation, and I think, or restoration, and that's going to be not benefit in the long run only, but it's going to be benefit tomorrow on the table, as income and benefits. I think the third thing that I would like to say is that we have to harness on the examples that already exist. And, Carlos Manuel, you did a fabulous job in Costa Rica when you were the first time of your Ministry of Environment with the payment for ecosystem services and completely changing the subsidy and the incentive to destroy nature and cut down the forest for land titles to incentivizing people to protect and restore and benefiting them because of that. Is the same that we did with CI Ecuador in the Sociobosque program. And it's actually recognizing the role that local people have in generating this wealth that we need, and that we can change those subsidies that are on the table destroying nature into these creative incentives. And the last thing that I would say is that creativity is required. We have to step out of the box, think about new ways of making this happen, bring the non-traditional stakeholders to the table. So it's not only the ministers of finance and the traders of commodities. We need, as we said, the farmers, the fishers, but also, we need civil society, we need the youth, we need the academia, we need people who can really and want to take their hats, like their institutional hat off and really think about a collective, a new design, a new model that is going to help us harness wealth for us now and in the future.
Muy bien, Patri. Well, I think that, you know, bringing some ideas together, I think that definitely we need to see the right people, as you just said, you know? And the right people is all of the stakeholders, but the communities are very important for this. And also subnational government. I've been talking about this with Carlos Manuel. You know, subnational governments are so important. It's not only the national government policy, because you know who is in charge of every action, every need on the territory? The mayor. He's the one. So we need to involve subnational governments, communities, the right people, and as Patricia said, we need to do this in a different way. We need data, we need numbers, and we need technology, because technology is the only tool that we have to accelerate the goals that we need. With data, technology, creativity, I think that we can do it, and sitting the right people on the table. Thank you.
So we're at a very interesting moment here in COP16, but more broadly seeing nature move up the development agenda, move up the agenda of so many governments. We have to be careful not to make two mistakes that the climate movement has made if we're to keep our agenda where it is and to keep the momentum to deliver on the global biodiversity framework. The first is we have to celebrate success. Right now we live in a world, particularly on the climate side, where there is huge climate fatigue setting in, because no matter what anybody does, and people are doing enormously good things, everybody just keeps saying the world is on fire, it's all just crap, nothing works. You know what politicians can't rally a constituency around? Is dread and fear. That may work in some aspects, and national security does not work in climate. We have to be careful on the nature side that, and on the subsidies discussion, if we want to build a coalition, not just of the willing, but of the working, to get behind the difficult choices that have to be made, it means we have to celebrate success. We have to put forward a positive vision of the future and rally people around that. Because climate hasn't done that well enough. And as a result, we've got huge mistrust as we go towards Baku. And that's happening in a world where there is huge mistrust, where multilateralism on the back foot. We need to, as the nature community, break from that tradition and start talking about what we can do, si se puede, not just about everything that's wrong. The second thing we have to learn, and this is something, Carlos, you mentioned, these conventions are driven by announceables. We all do it. Every single one of us have all of our meetings before all of these COPs about what are we going to announce. And the truth is that is driving a watering down of us being serious in this space. And especially on data, it's leading to an increased fragmentation. So every country uses something called a system of national accounts in order to think about its environmental decision making. And as part of that, the UN has now an agreed framework. It's called the UN System of Environmental Economic Accounts, to incorporate that environmental data into economic decision making. The UN SEA is what we all need to be behind. Instead, announceables are driving big conservation, UN agency, everywhere else to reinvent the wheel and come up with new ways to count environmental data. And all that's doing is giving people who already don't want to make decisions an excuse not to make them. So we have to get away from announcements driving a fragmentation of how we think about data and a watering down of the formal systems through which we are ever only going to be able to affect change. So if we can begin to present a positive vision and we can coalesce around the kind of data that exists and that is robust and that is accepted by ministers of finance,
years to document can happen quite quickly. And so it's interesting that many of at least the multilateral banks and now the Global Environment Facility have something they're calling a risk appetite for innovation, not for financial risk, but that if you're thinking about doing something innovative that may lead to not incremental change, but transformational change, we're willing to entertain that notion. And I think those are the kind of things that we need going forward. You mentioned that we need courage We need to pull people together, all the actors that need to be there, and in ways that don't exhaust the civil society. You know, we argue we want them from the very beginning of a project design through the development, obviously, of the solutions that allegedly will produce the outcome that is wanted. And produce databases that then will continue through time, which is something that's not always happening from government data or private sector data or public sector data. So we don't want to exhaust them, but we want to have them there at the right time. And I think very importantly, you know, a better characterization, coming back to the data, of the trade-offs and making those discrete, as well as the co-benefits and making those discrete, and for better or worse, putting a dollar amount on those co-benefits and trade-offs can really help going forward. So I think there's so much interesting, creative, innovative thinking that came out of this first session that I think going into the afternoon and then coming out of the end of the day, there's a real hope, Claude, that we might be able to develop what you called for, you know, sort of a blueprint on how to think about the implementation of Target 18. And so I think it would be time now for us to thank the wonderful panel and Barry Gardner one more time. And after coffee, we'll move into the next sections where we hope to hear from all of you. And so let me invite Lina Barrera, the Senior Vice President for Global Policy and Government Affairs from Conservation International, to explain how the next steps will occur. Thank you.